When it came to the early Americans, were they as paranoid as we were? Was everyone out to get them? We don't read a lot of philosophers in this class, but Thoreau is an interesting one because he has lessons that, well, I don't know how relevant they are. I mean, are we really worried about government overreach or oppression in our world? So let's talk about Thoreau. Whenever you're talking about a great thinker, it gets to be really important that you don't get lost on a quote farming expedition, because if you read isolated quotes from some thinkers, you might completely and utterly misrepresent what they do. Particularly if you're talking about someone like Thoreau, who is, yeah, a great American thinker, and if you want to compare him to other early American philosophers, he's up there. He gets known by a particular point of view which can easily lead to misinterpreting big quotes. And as far as the misinterpretations, you can get really dangerous with them. For instance, the first time I thumbed through Thoreau's Civil Disobedience without thinking about it as deeply as I should have, I narrowed down on this quote. The character inherent in the American people has done all that has been accomplished, and it would have done somewhat more if the government had not sometimes got in the way. It's very easy to read this and think not only does Thoreau not like government, that he might actually be anti-government. Well, for the record, Thoreau was not an anarchist. He addressed this in the article itself. I ask for, not at once no government, but at once a better government. Instead, it's probably a bit more accurate to describe Thoreau as an individualist, someone who is more invested in the power of individuals rather than groups, rather than leading organizations. Again, if we want to go to a quote, there will never be a really free and enlightened state until the state comes to recognize the individual as a higher power, an independent power, from which all its own power and authority are derived, and treats him accordingly. Now, it's easy enough to talk about Thoreau's individualism, but I wanted to pull the lens back and talk about how reading for a particular organizational theme, a particular way of thinking about the world, can help you use one author's work and start to connect it to other things. Because that's one of the things we've been talking about before, is how do you connect the various things you think, feel, believe, and run across and research into some kind of unified whole. Thoreau was very much, like a lot of people, invested in the dichotomy between individuals and groups. He's an individualist, so we know he favors the individual, but where do you draw the lines between these two? How do you connect them? How do you separate them? Who do you prioritize when it comes to a particular case? Now, in American history, a lot of what we do is guided by how we think about the founding fathers. You've heard of people who call themselves constitutional originalists. It's a phrase that comes up a lot when judges are talking. But let's not misrepresent how the founding fathers really thought about things. For one, did they think they were creating the great democracy? Well, no, they didn't. They didn't actually like democracy because they didn't actually like the masses. The masses scared them, and a lot of how the original Constitution was lined up was to draw some lines of distinction between the people and the government. Now, they had reasons for fearing the masses. The Constitution was ratified the same year as the French Revolution started, and it didn't take a great mind to see that the French Revolution, while it might have had some very laudable motivations behind it, quickly boiled down to anarchy. And if there was one thing a lot of the founding fathers agreed on, is that if you let the people fully rule everything, go hog wild, you can run into some dangerous situations. Thomas Jefferson, who's one of our more individualist founding fathers, said, "A democracy is nothing more than mob rule where 51% of the people may take away the rights of the other 49. But it wasn't just Thomas Jefferson. In lots of ways, Alexander Hamilton came at government with a completely different mindset. But Hamilton himself, there's something wrong here, isn't there? That's better. Hamilton himself said, "It has been observed that a pure democracy, if it were practicable, would be the most perfect government. Experience has proved that no position is more false than this. The ancient democracies in which the people themselves deliberated never possessed one good feature of government. Their very character was tyranny, their figure deformity." And it wasn't just the founding fathers. You can go back throughout history and philosophy and find lots of people who didn't really have a lot of time and energy for democracy. Well, let's take this back to Thoreau. How did Thoreau feel about the masses? Well, he wasn't really a fan of them, but he really held his true contempt for the government. He did not like the government and thought the government was a much bigger threat than the people. Thoreau wrote, "A government in which the majority rule in all cases cannot be based on justice, even as far as men understand it," which seems to line up a lot with a lot of what the founding fathers said. But Thoreau mostly focused on the government causing other people to be corrupt, and he had reasons for thinking this too. He was particularly upset with slavery and how even states that did not sanction slavery wouldn't go after the states that did. He was also particularly upset with the Mexican-American War. I don't know how much you learned about the Mexican-American War when you were in high school, but I know we didn't talk about it much when I was growing up. And it's probably because the more I've learned about the Mexican-American War, it was not America's best time. It was not a particularly noble mission. The U.S. Army didn't behave particularly well, and it's hard to argue that it was anything other than a great land grab. So if you're faced with these large issues that you think are particularly bad for the people, what do you do? How do you proceed? Do you just spout off angry missives? Well, the letters to the editor approach did not work for Thoreau, because in the battle between active resistance and passive resistance, he had no faith in passive resistance. He thought you had to go out of your way to risk things. Thoreau particularly said, "Action from principle, the perception and the performance of rights changes things in relations. It is essentially revolutionary." When he thought that something was going wrong, he refused to support it in any way, shape, or form. He even went to jail because he refused to pay taxes to his local government because he thought they didn't do enough to fight slavery. Yes, Thoreau is about resisting by breaking the law. Dangerous, huh? But he thought it was the moral thing to do. Disobedience is the true foundation of liberty. The obedient must be slaves. You were only free if you didn't go along with the masses. And to his mind, the masses weren't just the masses of people, they were the organizations which controlled them. So he wasn't necessarily anti-government, but he was anti a government which wouldn't stand up to do things that he thought were right. And if there was a way to proceed in that, if it meant risking your own freedom, so be it. Extreme measures were required to accomplish your goals. Thoreau influenced a lot of activists. Gandhi, very much a fan of Thoreau. Martin Luther King, very much a fan of Gandhi and Thoreau. And they weren't the only ones who were inspired by him. But I want to take a step back and suggest something else. If we're really interested in the relationship between the individual and the group, and I think that you can use the individual-group relationship to examine a whole lot of things. It's quite clearly a major influence in a lot of philosophy. It's quite clearly a major influence in a lot of literature. It's quite clearly a major thing which sociology, government, and a lot of other disciplines deal with. Then you have to know that the views on the group and individual and how they change, if you trace that, you can really get an idea of how thought progresses throughout our history, how it goes from one extreme to the other. Let me just give you one example. of how focusing on the group and individual thing can lead to some real explanations. The Great Depression happened in the 1920s when the stock market exploded. In October 29, the bubble burst. In less than a week, the market dropped by almost half of its recent record. Billions of dollars were lost and thousands of investors were ruined. And the economy generally sunk around that. The president during the stock market crash and at the start of the Great Depression was Herbert Hoover. He wasn't in for big solutions, and he did his best to talk to individual businesses and individual businessmen. Don't fire people. Keep your process going. Blah, blah, blah. And it didn't really have any real effect on the recovery of the economy. His successor was Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was much more collectivist in his point of view. He thought that sometimes society had to work en masse to propose solutions and to take active roles in things. And we're starting to get a little bit beyond our scope, but you see the different relationship between groups and individuals is a major distinction between these two presidents and these two approaches to improving the society. But that's not all. The other thing I want to bring up is when you talk about the whole group versus individual thing, when we talk about who the group is, who's controlling us, we tend to focus on government as the ultimate evil. At least if you look at how politicians talk and how politics works, the role of the government tends to show up a lot. I think Ronald Reagan was one of the most active in saying government isn't the solution, it's the problem. That's not the exact quote, but it was something along that lines. But why do we not hold the same skepticism towards mass control for non-government entities? After all, aren't we controlled by big businesses? Aren't we controlled by religion? Aren't we controlled by media? Aren't we controlled by our technology? And if we're controlled by all these things, can we respond in a Thoreauian manner? Can you do civil disobedience to all these groups? If not, how do you respond? Sometimes the big themes, I know that they're the kind of thing that you used to talk about when you're talking about fiction, man versus society, man versus nature, man versus self, but they can be really good analytical tools. Thoreau was very much invested in the group versus individual thing. He would not have been a fan of groupthink, but then again, a lot of early Americans weren't. Our thoughts have changed on that quite a lot. Now we have everything from severe collectivism to radical individualism. And what the relationship between individuals and larger groups are is something that people think about a lot. I don't know how much they come out and say it, though. As I said in the earlier portion, it's something that does come up in a lot of academic disciplines, and it's one of those tools that you can use to really help you make your analyses something that you can connect. If you have thoughts about individuals versus groups in Thoreau, how does that apply to other philosophy? How does that apply to how does that apply to a particular political movement? How does it apply to a teacher who has problems speaking when he reads things? Probably shouldn't do that last one. Anyway, just a thought. See you next time.